Good evening. This is Goldie. It's June 10th, 2010. We're going to be talking tonight. I've got my co-host on. His name is Swill. A couple things I want to get through. One, a big disclaimer. I'm not giving any legal advice. I'm not giving any real estate advice. I'm not giving any advice whatsoever. And I do want to thank everybody that over the years has put up with my actual rantings that I would do following a couple of cups of coffee or a couple of drinks. And those people are, everybody knows who they are. And they are obviously all of my friends who I've been doing that with. Anyway, this type of program, and I've done 3 or 4 of them, they're not up for public consumption yet, but it really allows me to rant so that I don't have to do it when my friends are around. And I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot. There's a lot of purposes to this rant, and including that first one, which it actually helps me, and to the extent that you hear certain arguments or phrases or things said to you, maybe it'll help you. One of the main points that I'm trying to do here is dissect any message that you hear so that we can figure out who is the source of the message. So when you hear a phrase like, at the basketball court, downtown, somebody calling you a socialist during the primaries for the Democrats, the president in 2008, you know that they're watching Fox, and that's fine. At least you know what that message is, and that day that message was socialist. Today's message is really how bad the oil spill is, which is interesting. Number 2, we want to try and reach some actual, I'm going to call them truths in quotation marks, about a few things, at least as I see it. Obviously, it's going to be my opinion and people that eventually call in, or my co-host. And so we want to actually come up with a few things. We have done a prior one on the Arizona immigration law, and it seemed like there was a couple of truths out there for that. That may not actually reach the level of a solution, but it gets you at least to some point farther along than either being called pro-racial profiling or anti-wall. And those are kind of the main goals that we're going to try and do. Now, I had promised a couple of friends, because over the years I've come up with a lot of theories that hopefully connect a bit, just to help people understand what they're seeing and hearing, and maybe to act on it and how they can act on it. Under the unified theory, I'm just calling it that, we generally talk about that individuals operate for their own self-interest. I need to put food on my table, I need shelter over my head, I need clothes. And we know that successfully some form of the free market, which we're not going to define tonight what that is, because our market is really not that free, but some form of the free market has allowed me to buy this computer, to have this time, to be able to sit here to talk about it. Number 2 is that there's a thing called the commons, and the commons is land, water, air. It can include laws between people. So how I deal with my neighbor when the fence wants to be, I want to build a fence, or my dog runs over there and does something over there. So maybe it includes all these laws that we have that govern our behavior, that keep us stopping at red lights. It may be the healthcare of the nation. It's very possible that it is. I will argue at some point, not tonight, that it is a commons. And once we realize that we've got all of these items for which there is no proponent, there is nobody supporting the air, the water, the land, then we actually have come up with a time when libertarians, a pure libertarian, would say no government, pure libertarian, no laws, no rules. But we can pretty much agree, having seen that oil spill, that we need to have some rules, because we're going to be paying to clean it up. We're paying to have the air cleaned up. Starting in the 70s, we got the Clean Air Act. Here's an article, October 20th, 2009, the New York Times. And this was talking about burning fossil fuels costs the United States about $120 billion a year in health costs premature deaths from air pollution. The point is, when you pay your $2.60 or $2.59 or whatever gasoline is today, you're paying that low cost, but then you're paying the actual cost of burning it later on. You're dying earlier of lung cancer or whatever else you get. Or you're cleaning up beaches, or you're sending the army down there to clean up the beaches. So now we have number one, we have self-interest, which is the free market, and we have number two, the commons. And it seems like we need some regulation of the commons. Number three, and we'll have a little more extended discussion on this, is that basically in DC and in this state of Texas, the lobbyists rule what occurs because there is no realistic leveling method with a single voter or a single donor. And I'm pointing to the Citizens United case. Basically unlimited soft spending, basically. There's no way to compete against that money. Can't be done. So we end up having rules written by industry. I've always been told when I do my pro bono work and I'm trying to get something drafted that I want somebody to approve, you bring a draft of what you want them to approve. The lobbyists for oil companies come in and bring the regulation written that the way they want it. And they bring it to some mid-level EPA administrators or mining and whatever that mining group was that failed in its duty and was partying. Swill, do you know who that group was?
Which group was that?
That was the guys that were supposed to be overseeing the oil leases and overseeing this type of stuff. Do you remember that group? And then they got caught partying. There was a huge party, illegal drugs, alcohol, in any event.
I remember what you're talking about. I just don't know the name of them.
But really, if you think about it, the people that are administering any of the rules that do come out, they're not getting paid that much money. So even a small, limited contribution to them makes their life easy. And in the form of, it just makes it easier if somebody hands you the regulation. So we've got a really severe problem in that the group that is supposed to be overseeing the commons does not. The commons is being decimated, and I don't mean decimated, I'm not trying to put a moral thing on here. To me, it's legitimate for any free market enterprise to take as much as legally as possible. If that means you can dump your tannery waste in Lake Austin, so be it. If it's allowed, you have to do it, because if your neighbor does it and you don't do it, you go out of business. That's kind of the free market, so we know that. But we know we kind of want fresh water in the city of Austin.
Well, what we discovered was the concept of quality of life. And once that sort of self-concept started to be developed, and it may have been discussed previously, but it really came into everybody's minds, I think, in the 60s and 70s. That's when we started saying, we really have to watch out for the environment. And I think, going further, what you're worried about, particularly in the case of the oil spill, is this concept of, who writes the environmental laws and puts the caps on what your reward can be if there's a spill. There's evidently some cap. We were talking about this earlier, but we didn't discuss this. A cap on what they might have to pay in damages per spill. And
of course.
So that's a big problem. And all of that goes into, well, why do we have federal laws, a federal statute that says that, there are limitations and all that? Who writes them?
Well, this was the same thing that happened with tort reform. Tort reform was written by industries that have liability for products liability or slip and fall, the medical community certainly, but it was really anybody who had any manufacturing plant. And we ended up having tort reform in Texas. They argued what happened, but yeah, it's obvious that any type of cap that you see has been imposed by the person who's paying the money. They're the ones that have lobbied their individual legislators, for sure.
Yeah, the companies who have the most to lose, they're going to get in there and try like hell to cap it off.
Right, so we know, I mean, we have always seen, you always see this, and if you get these environmental groups, thank God, they at least are gathering up funds and are able to file lawsuits, and Sierra Club, et cetera. Earth First, they do more violent acts, which I don't call for, but they're able to actually try and combat it in other ways or with money. And that's really, there's nobody else doing it. I can't go call my senator and go, I'm really perturbed with the way the drug war is going. He's not going to see me. But when a drug company calls him up, who's given a whole bunch of money or has provided money, whatever the legal method is under Citizens United, and they say, we really need to make sure that Xanax and Paxil, Vicodin are the alternatives for people in this country. And again, I mean, if the Commons includes our health care, that is a lobbyist writing the regulations for the legislators.
That's right. I mean, we talked about lobbying, but you see, at the root of all of this is lobbying. I mean, if you see abuse, it's lobbying. Now, everyone can lobby, but everybody can cause problems. And as I said, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but we discussed this previously, that all lobbying seeks to subvert a few things, but mainly it subverts the free market. In other words, a corporation goes in and lobbies for some legislation so it can carve out its own distinct piece of the market so that it isn't disturbed by competition, thereby, guaranteeing profits.
Well, it's definitely one of the gigantic nails in the coffin of when you're talking about, and you're using the phrase free market. There's not a question everybody lobbies to get their little handout. Everybody does.
They lobby, to the extent that you're allowed to do this under our system, if you're really like a free markets guy, you don't like lobbying. And you can get there either with someone who's liberal, I know you want to avoid labels, but if you're true to your principles as a conservative, you don't like lobbying because it really screws up the free market.
Not even a question. A real conservative, what we'll call a capital C conservative.
Not a Goldwater conservative, not a George Bush.
Whatever that is.
Conservative, who I call a Christian socialist.
Okay.
I think Bush was. But anyway, I digress. Anyway, the lobbying really, I said to you previously once that we should really run all lobbying through the Department of Justice.
And I think I had mentioned to you that I don't think that can be done just because of separation of powers, but I think there would be a method that...
It's worthy of discussion.
It is worthy of discussion, and certainly if I had my legal producer somewhere around here instead of off in the wilderness, then we would be able to find out the answer to this question.
But it probably be struck down on free speech.
Well, that it would certainly be one of the arguments, but the other one would be if there is some type of compliance officer that's there that is actually run by the legislative body that you're lobbying. So they can have, they have their ethics departments and they could potentially do it that way. But in any event, the point is that whenever there's a communication between any individual or entity or all the gigantic list of words that describes any entity, you're saying that you want to have somebody in there listening to that conversation, making sure it's a legal conversation.
I'd rather have government spending, time and resources on that than doing a lot of other things, than pursuing more welfare programs. In the same way that I'd rather have more, say, good environmental regulation than welfare in all of its forms.
I understand.
Let's use government for, the argument is always, I suppose, how much do you want to use government for and where? And that's what everybody fights about, I guess.
Absolutely. All right, well, moving on from that lobbying problem, which we'll go into greater detail at some point, the great battle, there's no question that the great battle is between the free market and the commons. That's always the great battle. I mean, when there's a polar bear up in the north, everybody wants to protect the polar bear. And then it turns out that will limit the number of coal plants that are allowed in Texas, when the EPA takes over TCEQ, by the way, a current story here in Texas. EPA may be taking over the responsibilities of the state agency. But in any event, when you see that polar bear and you want to make it protected, then it limits somebody's profits. Always. Always.
Well, installing a scrubber is a mandate to install.
No. But I'm saying that the great battle is always between those two things. It's always between those two things. It's always between the person who is using as much of the commons as they can and lobbying for the use of that commons and making sure they're not going to be regulated as much and setting caps for responsibility. And us, of course, knowing that in order to even be able to have these computers and phones to do this call and this show, you have to have the free market and they have to be making profits. It's one of our truths.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that battle is always going on. So when I'm arguing for the commons, the only thing I'm doing is I'm always trying to bring up the point that somebody has to watch out for it. And ultimately, there are hidden costs in us paying $2.59 a gallon that come up later that would have been cheaper for us to pay $2.89 a gallon and have barrier islands ready and have preventers ready and have robots that go that deep ready. And I'm saying that as taxpayers, you should be really pissed off that you had not thought before that you were ultimately responsible. That's the painful thing. So maybe you'll start thinking that since you're ultimately responsible, we would rather, like with him doing the shallow leases again, do we know that they're following the current rules? It appears against catastrophic events like this, they're not. Or it's so dangerous, who knows? Now, who knows how to stop this kind of high-pressure blowout? It takes a long time. But the taxpayers are ultimately responsible.
They always are.
Of course they are, but don't shirk your responsibility and go, I'm really happy to have the cheap gas. All right, number 5, this is a part of the unified theory. Corporations, and when I say corporations, I mean any entity that's not an individual person, they are not beholden to any individual country. In the beginning, they were.
Not typically.
In the beginning, they were. Just think of the British companies that came over here and explored the Northeast. They got the money from the king or the queen.
And major trading companies.
Yes, and so wars and skirmishes and battles and property grabs, they were all centralized. In other words, if that company was owned by the king and his family, then they would send out these guys, they've given them some money, and they hope to get some riches back.
And those who organized those trading companies, the few who got in there with the king, they made a lot of money. You know, there's your first example of crony capitalism.
No doubt, no doubt. But they were competing against other nation states. So you might be competing against the French trading company.
Yep.
They were more aligned with the country.
By the government.
Subsidized by the government, but at least these were individual entities, kind of like China, you know? Whenever you're dealing with a Chinese company, you're actually dealing with the Chinese government as well. So you really are just dealing with them. But in any event, over time, with multinationals, corporations are no longer beholden at all to any individual country. Any individual country.
Because as long as they're making money, who cares?
Well, this helps you on the message, okay? Looking at the message of what you see. Like when you see NAFTA, you have to think, how is it going to make money for those corporations that use the law? And so when you hear you're not going to lose any jobs, again, I'm not saying I'm for or against NAFTA. I'm saying when you hear and you heard that you weren't going to lose any jobs, you have to know what the message was. The message was, we're not going to lose any jobs, the people that own the corporation.
Well, it's going to be good for
the shareholders, the board of directors, okay, the big shareholders.
Yeah.
And so when we hear patriotic exclamations that come out of any corporation or broadcaster or advertisement, you've got to remember that the message is different. There's no linkage between the United States and any corporation, except ones that only do business here, only buy things from here, which I don't even know how you could do that, only buy electricity from here, whatever. So,
well, yeah, and that corporate, well, you could say the multinational nature of business today is at odds with the commons. That's your, I think you're...
well, not only is it at odds with the commons, but it used to be that we would be okay for another country to become decimated. It was no problem. As a country and as a corporation, like a logging company going to Brazil, let's say, we would do whatever was good for that logging company. But now, what's good for that logging company may be for them to come here and decimate us. There's no linkage.
Well, yeah, you just hope that you have good laws that stop.
Well, that's the point. That's when the commons becomes even more susceptible to overusage, is when the corporations are not even operating within the framework of an individual country. So the message has now become much more convoluted, and we just have to be careful of that message. You just have to be careful when you hear the message.
No, it's true.
All right, I'm going to go through, I've got a couple of specific items that are really kind of bugging me. Yesterday I spoke at a public hearing of a commission and against surveillance cameras. And it turns out, I guess it doesn't turn out, you should never be shocked when somebody does something that you already know they're going to do. So for example, when I try and bring up a subtle distinction of surveillance cameras, and I'm talking about surveillance cameras put up by the Austin Police Department, and then those images being transmitted to what's called ALEC, a fusion center that is a multiple party, multiple law enforcement group. When I say that the right of my privacy inside my private property is more important than preventing the one crime, which, by the way, the chief brought up. He brought up actually two crimes. But that right to privacy is so important. And I understand, we could put 100,000 cops out on the streets at all times in Austin, and that would maybe prevent some crimes on the streets. It wouldn't prevent those crimes inside, indoors, etc. But in any event, that right to privacy is so important. And those images that will be captured from those cameras, and have been captured in the past, once those images get out illegally or by mistake or picked up on Wi-Fi or hacked into and put out on the internet on YouTube, careers are done. Careers will be done.
Well, I asked you the question, or what were you objecting to? I said, are the cameras rotating so they can
No, this is
shoot at 360 degrees?
here's the problem. They will not tell you. They will not tell you the reach of the cameras, where the cameras will be pointed. Now, they've now said they're going to delete the images after 10 days automatically. But my point is, there's a phrase in the law called irreparable harm.
Yeah.
And irreparable harm to me is when two girls, or excuse me, when two FBI workers, by the way, it's not two FBI agents, it's in Buckhannon, West Virginia.
Yeah.
They were viewing a shopping mall camera private image of two girls changing into prom dresses. They were fired. There was some misdemeanor or some such crap. And to me, if truly they got those types of images, or let's say some worse images, and they get out, it's irreparable harm to those people. They're never going to run for office. They're not going to get into law school. They may not be able to get into college. It'll be tougher to get a job. Their parents might disown them. And so, because the harm is irreparable, And the danger, and I mean, this is the thing that bothers me about the Tea Partiers and people that call themselves conservatives. If you say government can't do anything right, what possibly makes you think that this portion of government can protect these images? How can you be a Tea Partier or a capital C conservative or even a Reagan conservative, whatever Hannity is, and support these things when on the one hand you say government can do nothing right? On the other hand, they're going to protect images of your daughter because some software is going to blank out the face, which they now admit doesn't work.
Well, the libertarians all dislike all this stuff as long, you know.
And I'm not. I mean, my point is not.
Libertarian types, you know, are against all that stuff, and they're against national ID cards too.
No. I understand that. All I'm doing is I'm pointing out that that's my main argument on why there's a danger with surveillance. Now, the other part of that equation is that legitimately kids are walking past a crack dealer on their way to the bus stop, okay, during school zone hours. Put a cop out there. I totally and absolutely wholeheartedly agree that should not happen.
Yeah.
I don't think that cameras are the way to do that. Now, I had an argument with a gentleman before we went into the commission room yesterday, 2 days ago, excuse me, when we were talking about it, and I go, well, how would you like a camera shining into your bathroom? And he goes, come on in. I'm okay with it. Come on. Big fat guy. Overweight gentleman. No, but he's totally, okay. And he brought up, now this is my point, I'm finally getting to the subtle distinction that the commissioners do not understand. And the subtle distinction is that when you're out there trying to gauge community input for as important of a civil liberty as my right to privacy inside my property, you do not have the right, if you are not, like, for example, that gentleman said it's okay for them, for APD, to shine that camera in on me. And I totally respect his right to say that. The thing is, he does not have the right. And I don't mean he doesn't have the right to say, he has rights of free speech, of course, but I'm not going to listen to his opinion when he recommends to APD or to a neighborhood association or to a commission or to a downtown Austin alliance that he's okay with cameras shining in on me.
Hey, what's your responsibility? Think about it like a philosophy student. What's your responsibility in maintaining your own right to privacy?
Well,
don't you have an obligation? As you know, most things are a two-way street in our legal system.
No. And we don't have a right to privacy. They brought up what the constitutional argument was in public spaces. You don't have a right to privacy out there, but you have a right to unreasonable intrusions on that privacy. I certainly know that. I know what's out there.
Don't you have an obligation to protect your privacy by drawing the drapes?
Well, there's such a thing as the expectation of privacy, which you and I have discussed in the past. And the fact is, you're calling me, if you're on a mobile phone, or really, let's talk about those portable phones that first came into the homes.
Yeah.
Those portable phones, you could hear your neighbor talking. So after a period of time, you should know that you don't have a real expectation of privacy when using that portable phone. That's the changing nature of the expectation of privacy. Now, once they put the cameras up, you're going to look up there and go, there's a camera there. And you're not going to be able to, you can make the argument, but realistically, the camera's there, you've seen it, it's out in the public, it's on the light pole looking down into your backyard. Do you really have an expectation of privacy anymore? I argue that the expectation of privacy is being eroded due to these little incremental changes and allowances.
There's no question. The problem is every time we try to police anything in this society, there's always a ceding of rights. I mean,
but this is too fundamental. Look.
Percentage of your rights are being ceded every time you try to combat a problem.
Well, for example, getting on Facebook and putting pictures up there, okay? Do you expect that those pictures are going to stay private?
No
I don't.
expectation of privacy.
Well, these kids are getting used to the Facebook attitude where, this is what we do. We put this up. I'm going to text this to you. It's going to be a mass text. Here's my picture. Here I am. And that expectation of privacy has dropped. But
And then
that's
how
my
about,
point.
you know-
We cannot, look, London has the most cameras per person in the world, and there is no significant statistical increase in either prevention of crime or catching criminals. Yes, you're going to catch one or two, because they're going to do their crime underneath the cameras, and that's what the chief argued. But let me tell you something that's very critical. He argued two things: that there was a sexual assault and they had not stopped the sexual assault, but they had been able to catch the guy because he was identified on a camera. And there's a hushed, everybody gets hushed, and I agree with it. The second thing he said was the Times Square bomber was caught by cameras, surveillance cameras. That's false. Now, I don't want to say it's a lie, but what I heard was that it was a hot dog vendor and a cop on a horse that caught that guy.
That was, you know what, it was a 1-2 punch.
Yeah, no, they got the
A
problem
vendor or some sort of a vendor alerted a cop
on a horse.
to behavior. If you see something, say something.
There was some smoke coming out, and then the cop got it, some detectives down there, and they looked at the VIN number, just like any other cop that would see a car included in a crime, and he then found the person that sold it, and then they found the person that bought it, and they found the person.
Well, then the video...
Okay, but this is, now the video got it wrong.
Positively identify who the guy was.
Now, how about the guy that was running through there around that time in the red running shorts?
Or was he falsely pursued?
Yes.
I don't know.
But in any event, my point was that, oh, and let me bring up a further point. This argument was made by Bill O'Reilly about a week or two ago, talking about, take that ACLU, surveillance cameras caught the Times Square bomber. What's slightly frightening is that it's obvious that certain members of the police department, at least in Austin, are watching Fox and using the arguments from O'Reilly. So when people say they can't watch that stuff, look, it's important. It's really important.
Hey, when does Fox own an argument?
They don't.
Thought. There's no independent thought. That's like trying to throw your arms around patent ideas.
Well,
I thought of that
well,
years ago.
well, the funny thing and the good thing with Fox is at least their message is consistent. You know, it stays consistent throughout the day, so it's not that hard to figure out what the message is. You have to try and dissect how they're doing it. They're having problems with drill, baby, drill.
You know what? If I go get a radio show, is Glenn Beck going to try to say, you stole this idea from me? I've always had a big problem with, in poli-sci teaching and in historical teaching in universities and colleges with the idea that fascism is not socialism, is not a child of the left. And Mr. Beck, Herr Beck, is properly and rightly saying fascism is a child of the left. But nothing to do with the right. Absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah,
And I agree with him. But the thing is, what is... That's one of the things that I would discuss on an ongoing basis. So what are you going to say? That
No, when we have our discussions about,
Beck's going to come back to me and go, hey, Wilcox, you can't offer up that theory.
well, no, I understand. And when we talk about the distinctions, we're going to have our,
I was the first to go national with that. It's like,
yeah, I got you. Take it easy. All right, I want to move on to one that's kind of been bugging me, okay? All right. This is kind of like, I guess it's the same thing as when we have an extremely important right that is about to be given away, an important civil right, then in the event that we can't guarantee substantial compliance, then we can't have it at all. And I'm going to argue this one, because I was talking about the cameras before. And since they cannot safeguard the data sufficiently to overcome the harm, the irreparable harm that will be done from the distribution of these images, it's a slight digression argument, but I use the same argument for capital punishment.
Because if only one person died,
No.
the system ultimate.
No. And really, there was a 1974 case that was decided by the Supreme Court. I don't remember the name of it, but they went through all of the differing percentages of if you're black that kills a white, you're 10 times more likely than a white that kills a black to get the death penalty imposed upon you, et cetera. Forgetting about just sheer numbers of whatever crimes are happening, there's a huge study that was done that makes it appear that there is some type of bias in the system that certainly has not been overcome. And when you see the numbers, it's more socioeconomic than color. If you make under $10,000 a year, or excuse me, if you make over $10,000 a year, the likelihood that you're on death row, it just doesn't happen. So for this most important of a right, your life, since you cannot guarantee that it's being done correctly, and the example that I usually give to people at a cocktail party would be, if there's a God, God sees you plan the crime, and the second that you commit the murder that you planned, your head gets lopped off, I am all for that death penalty. But my argument here is that since that's not what happens ever, you can't actually have the death penalty. It's too important of a thing morally for us as a country.
You could limit it, I don't know.
You can't, look, man,
But
it
the
doesn't...
abortion, look, it's the, how can you, well, you'll just throw it out there, you don't have to argue it. It's the whole thing about if you're pro-abortion, you should be pro-death penalty, and vice versa. How do you not be for one and be for the other?
I'm with you there. I like to bring up that when you have a fundamental right
Something.
For something, whether it's privacy, or whether it's your life, or your rights against unreasonable search and seizure, these things are too important to allow slipshod. This would even be a Patriot Act argument. I'm not going to do that, but it's the same argument against the types of thing like the Patriot Act.
You're almost beginning to make the argument because the handling of evidence in a criminal matter cannot be handled perfectly, and often is not, by the police being owned by the government, administered by the government, that you can't do criminal,
No, I'm not saying that.
activity.
Look, all I'm doing, I'm coming up with the most important of all the rights, okay? The thing about people that are in jail, there's a thing called the Innocence Project in Texas where they have some funding and then they help you prove your innocence or get another DNA test, etc. So irreparable harm was the phrase that I'm using that creates the distinction. We can repair it. I mean, it's bad if somebody sits in jail for 20 years and then gets out because now we tested DNA. But if they're dead, they're dead. It just makes an easy argument against the death penalty. And again, how can you as a Tea Partier or a capital C conservative or a small c conservative have any confidence in the criminal justice system to say it's being done right? How do you morally do that? How do you argue on the one hand that government can't do anything, but here it's perfect?
Well, you can't argue. Well, the thing that people have to be careful, say, well, your argument is against those people who say government never does anything right. I mean, I'm a big conservative, but Goldwater conservative, but I don't argue against government because you need government. You need functions of government. I mean, even at the most basic level. So if you're going to argue against that, I mean, look, if you're going to be a libertarian, you may as well argue for communism.
Well, if you're going to be a pure libertarian, I mean, there's no such thing.
I don't
You can't.
think.
There's no such thing as a pure libertarian because they stop at stop
I don't
signs.
think politics is a circle. They don't all come back to the same place. Because you're still, they're fundamental arguments to communism and libertarianism that, make them fundamentally different animals, period. But anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely true.
But that's an argument for another day.
It is definitely an argument for another day. All right, there's been a couple of articles that have been written in the actual Austin Chronicle. Michael Ventura has really done a great job about oligarchy and really the idea that large entities rule. And I had written that paper in 2006, which was just elites and non-elites. I was freaking out over what I was seeing during the Bush administration. I mean, I saw this gigantic concentration of wealth, and I needed to put it on paper because it was a part of my rant. It just seemed like that there was a smaller and smaller percentage of people getting more and more. Middle class was disappearing and being pushed down, and that's continued now. And so I came up with elites and non-elites. Michael Ventura's got like 5 categories. The elites, they don't worry about money. They don't even worry about earning money. They don't worry about losing money. We know who they are. The non-elites, those are the people that are getting behind. So it might include some people in the making $200,000 a year, but they're getting behind every month, every single month.
Yeah.
In discussing this thing, I realized that there's actually a third major category, which is elite support. And you and I have talked about this before. I mean, I was elite support. You're elite support as well. And elite support is if you're a service industry of some kind, accountant, broker, attorney, CPA, builder, well, not really builder, but if you're in one of those white-collar support groups working for millionaires, you can make that big living. If you can pay off your mortgage, then maybe you won't fall into the non-elite. So there's really the third thing there, which is elite support.
You could be an asbestos attorney.
And so, and in 2006, remember, it was feeling like Republican control was going to occur forever. You remember that?
Yep.
Remember red states?
Yeah, I know. Well,
People making under $30,000 a year supporting policies that were totally for people making over $1 million a year, which...
I know, but here's the problem with the whole thing about, look, the left had to come back they had to come up with something. They said those damn supply siders have beaten us again. Revenues to the government, all during the Reagan years, even under JFK. JFK was a big tax cutter. He cut he cut tax rates across the board and capital gains. Revenues went up, and the stock market took off in the 60s. Because I think LBJ, he spent more, but he kept the tax policies. He and the Democratic Congress kept the tax policies that JFK put in place.
Well, we also had cheap oil.
But we also ran up deficits that was the beginning of our running up of deficits that we're still paying for.
Right.
But then, Reagan came along, cut taxes again because they went galloping up again. And, so that you had a top rate in a top category of, 80 to 90% for that dollar made in that category.
Well, he also released the hounds,
Yeah, so
the S&Ls.
I can be very fair and say the SNL, boondoggle screwed up a rational analysis of supply side.
Now that is a reasonable argument to talk about, and you never hear that from any of these Reagan conservatives at all, because to me, whenever I hear somebody say that they are a Reagan conservative, but deregulation of the S&Ls, sorry about that, that loosening of the tax code that allowed those 7 and 8 to 1 write-offs that got hammered down in 1986 and killed everything.
Yep.
If you can say that as a Reagan conservative, now we're talking.
No, of course, and there's a great book called Inside Job that 3 guys wrote, Pizzo, Fricker, and Wolo, and it discusses the S&L crisis. It was written in the late 80s, and it really said, look, this was a major fiasco. Both parties deserve huge trouble for this and blame, and it was ridiculous. And it clouded whether supply side worked, but believe me, supply side worked. And it's a shame that they didn't just cut taxes and, pay a little more attention to keeping the banking system, conservative and solvent, because it was a big giveaway.
It was a giveaway, as is what's going on right now. It was kind of interesting. I was asked by an old friend today, somebody who actually saw my speech yesterday or 2 days ago, and he had asked me, we were just talking about tax policy in the state of Texas and talking about how we have only property taxes, and he goes, wouldn't it be more fair to have an income tax? And I go, well, on the one hand, I'm okay with it in that it might be more fair and might not impose as much of a burden on property owners. But on the other hand, I don't want to grant any new money to the behemoth.
Yeah.
Because if you say, I'm going to transfer out property taxes for another type of franchise tax or whatever we did 3-4 years ago, we're running a big deficit right now. They're going to have some huge cuts. You just don't, you don't give them any more money.
No, you're feeding government.
So in that regard, a true Cap C conservative, I agree with. Because once you feed that behemoth, the bureaucracy, it's almost impossible to get rid of it. So my point to him was, yes, it would be more fair, but at this present time, I really don't want to be adding any new revenues to the extent that we don't have to, which obviously we're going to have to. But the idea of a trade-out, that's dumb, because once they already know how to get a revenue stream, they'll come back to it.
Well, you know what? I mean, Connecticut brought in an income tax. It was highly controversial. Democrats and Republicans alike opposed it.
Did your property taxes go down? I mean, what went down?
Something
Your
went
sales
down.
tax?
They said they were going to eliminate a bunch of taxes. They said, number one, they said it was going to be a temporary tax, and it had a sunset provision in it. The people, Lowell Weicker, you'll remember this, Lowell Weicker, Senator Lowell Weicker, who became governor, he ran against the tax in a three-way race. He ran against Rowland, who went to jail. Rowland, who was a little darling of the Republican Party, who ran as a big conservative, as a big supply-sider. But Lowell Weicker, running as a third-party candidate, won. He was against the tax. He comes in, he turns around with a Republican from Greenwich, Connecticut, a senator. They write the income tax legislation. They
What do you pay?
Those big cuts to the budget that was out of control.
How much is it? How much is your income tax?
It goes between 5, 5.5, and 6%, depending on income level. But
See, that's...
these guys also, we have a corporate income tax up here too, which you're not supposed to also have, and it's at 10%. And these guys in the state of Connecticut, the legislature, bumps it up. They arbitrarily throw on another 10%. Temporary increases, and all states do this, so that you then have a 20% tax on corporations. Well, what kind of effect on employment do you think that has?
They come to Texas, where we have kind of a limited franchise tax. They don't want to call it an income tax because we're not allowed to call it that due to our Constitution here.
Now you got two parties of big government. Rick Perry and those guys, they're up to their eyeballs in big government.
That's for sure.
Government is good government, and when it's the Democrats' government, it's bad government.
Well, that's true. Again, those are the small c conservatives. We're trying to stick with, what is it that we get. So we have seen here, we can add almost another truth, and that the trade-offs of types of taxes eventually leads to higher total taxes because they come back to the revenue stream. Would you agree with that?
What I want to say is, just to finish the point, they put in the income tax. Not only did they vote to make it permanent, the sunset provision never kicked in because they passed a law to scotch it. So they kept the thing in. Government took off. Government spending in Connecticut, little baby Connecticut with 3.5 million people in it, government spending took off at a 45-degree angle. Deficits were ratcheted up, and to the extent now we have about an $18 billion accumulated deficit in the state of Connecticut, and our bond rating just went down.
Well, you're not going to be the only
I
state.
don't want to do a thing about it.
You're not going to. We're all having the same problem. Now, here were the last couple of things I want to talk about. We only have a few minutes left.
Okay.
And I brought this up the other day when we were talking about that lobbying problem. And my idea was, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, and there is no question about it that since everybody believes that government is incompetent, that the level of incumbent acquisition of Citizens United soft money needs to ultimately go to the point of we have to have term limits for our federal senators and representatives. And let me give you an argument here. I'm just going to throw it out.
You don't have any argument from me.
No. But let me give you a competence argument, okay?
Yeah.
Since the claim today is that government is terrible and does nothing, they're incompetent, then I would be just as happy to have a new incompetent in there and eliminate the entrenched type of, I don't want to call it graft. I mean, it's really legal acquisition of campaign dollars that occurs.
Yep.
Let's limit them to 2 terms, since we all agree that all of these senators are terrible and all the representatives are terrible. We already have term limits on the president. We already agree they're terrible, they're incompetent. Then we're done with the incompetence argument.
Let's get to the solution.
Well, we know that that would at least cut off some. I mean, some people could work really quickly and talk to all the corporations, drug companies, insurance companies, et cetera, before they get elected. And then the only way that this works is, I put this out the other day with you, Swirl, was that I want to have a 10-year revolving door lobbying restriction. Now, I know we talked about, having an agent of the court or an agent of the House of Representatives or the Senate in there watching you, or the Justice Department if that were legal, whenever any lobbying takes place. But I'll tell you this, if you put a 10-year deal on there, these senators are not going to be there getting elected in order to get a job in industry. Because what are they going to do if they can't lobby the old boss, the old guy that they used to work for, who they've promised a job to? So you can't have, I mean, term limits won't work without the restriction on lobbying. I mean, it'll work a little bit, but it won't work as well. Do you agree?
Well, you could pass, what would prevent you from passing federal laws that say, again, everything will be challenged constitutionally? I mean, hell,
No, this would be a constitutional
the
amendment.
amendment was challenged constitutionally. Actually, I don't know if that passed. I think it passed.
No, they could set up a lobbying restriction that would eventually go in front of the Supreme Court, but so just Congress could do that. The question on the term limits, I believe that would require a constitutional amendment in order to do that.
Oh, yeah,
So I'm not worried about.
But by the way, while you're at it, it's stupid for senators to be in for that's very arbitrary. The 6 years is a very, very arbitrary number.
Well,
Take them both 4 years. House of Reps, what's wrong with the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, each being 4 years?
well, it's a little more, the original intent was to have a little more insulation to the vagaries of the electorate. Because every 2 years, you put your finger up in the air and see which way the wind's blowing
Remember that
as a rep.
the Senate rules changed. It became a more popular vote. They were subjected to a popular vote.
I understand.
They're just appointed, or they either elected by the legislature.
Well, they knew there was lobbying back then, I guess. I'm throwing this out as anecdotal evidence.
Now, I don't know what amendment that was to the Constitution that changed that, but it was one. That my Cato Institute Constitution, where is it?
Go grab it, because I've got mine up there and I'm not leaving dead space on the air.
Oh, that's it. Well,
But in any event, those two things,
most tuned.
those two specific items, term limits for our senators and reps, and I don't know the numbers. I don't know the number of terms. I'd say 2 for the senators. I don't know how many for those rep guys. They do get pretty entrenched in there. There's more of them. And then that restriction on lobbying for 10 years. So you're not going to go work for Halliburton and lobby the Defense Department to get that no-bid contract.
Look at a total prohibition.
Well, you could do that. 10 years seems fair. I mean, you could. My point is that we need to cut it off. It needs to be cut off. I don't care whether it's a total prohibition, which it sounds bad, it sounds unconstitutional as well, but a reasonable restriction would be some number of years.
By the way, I think it's the 17th Amendment.
Read it, please.
Okay. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof, for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite prerequisite for electors of the most numerous branches of state legislatures when vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate. It'll be
What's the
popular
date?
vote.
What's the date on that, sir?
The 1913, boy, just after the income tax.
There you go. So a constitutional amendment would be helpful in order to do the term
April 8,
limits.
1913. All finished, all done, sold.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Okay,
Well, Swill, we've gone through an awful lot of items tonight. I want to thank my dad for this glass, by the way. This is a beautiful glass. Thank you.
not bad.
And what we're trying to do is we're trying to piece together all of these divergent messages that we see every day. We see in the paper, see on the internet, see on Jon Stewart, you see on Fox, you hear from Keith Olbermann. Trying to dissect it and look at it for two things, again, so I don't have to say it to my friends. But I know when I hear somebody say the message or call me socialist, I know they watch Fox, and that's great. Today was June 10th, 2010. It was Goldie with Swill. Thanks for coming out.